All right, peeps. So this week we're going to walk down memory lane as I stroll through all of the things I used to read as a kid. Reading has always been my favorite pastime, and I can't wait to jump into taking a look at all of the things I used to worry my mom about buying me as a kid. I know recently I've been tasked with buying things for my niece to read, and she's running through things quicker than they can even be published. So it's been a hard time going to different bookstores, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, and just trying to keep her head filled with new content. And it's always fun for me to go to the bookstore because I always see things that I used to read that I can't wait to get her into, but also new things that I wish I had a chance to read, when I was younger. Hanging out with my niece at the bookstore has been fun because I get to reminisce, and it's what helped me come up with the episode for this week. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So one of the things that I've been able to, buy for my niece has been the Babysitters Club. And that's something I read as a kid, thoroughly. I don't think I ever got to the end of the series, but if I was at a bookstore and I saw a cover that I didn't recognize, it was up to me to talk my mom into buying them. And for younger me, it was very hard to try to talk her into buying things for me because, there wasn't always money in the budget for that. And thank goodness we relied heavily on our local libraries and the school libraries, which always had great stuff for me to check out. So I was able to get a good portion of the Babysitters Club books read, which is fun for me now because they're being made into graphic novels. And so I'm able to buy them illustrated for my niece, and she's enjoying every one of them. So I've made a list of the favorite ones that stand out to me. And of course, the first one, Christie's Great Idea. Scholastic had a hit on their hands with this one, and they knew how to capitalize on a market. So having a club of girls that made extra money on the side by babysitting kids in their neighborhood, it's a pretty mundane idea, but they always got into different issues when babysitting. So it was a great idea. It became a hit series, so they knew what they were doing. So number 2 on my list would be Marianne and the Great Romance. This is where she admits that she has a crush on a boy, Logan. And I think that was the first time I had read something like that at my young age. So it was a pretty big deal. And, how she goes about navigating her crush, whether or not they start dating, are they old enough to start dating, that sort of thing. And it was good to see how everybody, parents, Marianne, her friends, how they all handled that. So I'm not going to give too much away here because you can now read it as a graphic novel. Dawn's Wicked Stepsister. So I believe this is the story where Dawn and Marianne become sisters because their parents get married. And I can imagine what that would be like to be friends with somebody and know them in that aspect, but then end up having to live with them. And now this person is your sister because your parents got married. That's kind of weird. So I remember reading that and, them sharing a room, and they think that it would be the best thing ever because they're friends, and how their relationship changed over time. Good and bad. So good times for that. One that I discussed with my niece has been Claudia and Mean Janine, how her and her sister don't get along. Claudia is pretty bright and rambunctious, and her sister is pretty nerdy and pretty by the book. So they often clash, but they end up having to work together and understand each other after their grandmother has a stroke. So my niece she couldn't wait to call me and tell me what she thought about the story, which I find hasn't been changed all that much. So I think that's great. And then, of course, Claudia and the bad joke. There is a joke war happening between the Babysitters Club and this child that they're that they're babysitting, and the pranks get more and more obnoxious, and Claudia is actually injured, ends up breaking her leg because a prank goes too far, and the babysitters want to teach the prankster a lesson in as much as you could do with somebody else's child, right? So those are the titles that stand out to me. And of course, you know, I went back and was looking at when this was written, and apparently it was written by Anne Martin back in 1986. And I think there's still a couple of things that she's writing to this day. So it says 1986 to present, 172 million copies sold worldwide. And I wonder if that number has been adjusted because they're being reprinted now. And it's a hot commodity. They're not on the shelf anywhere at Barnes & Noble. So I've had to order from Amazon. But it's been ranked the 15th best-selling kids series of all time. And I bet that now you guys know what number one is. Of course, that's Harry Potter. So I have some stories about Harry Potter because that didn't start being written until I was in the 7th grade. And so it's interesting to tell people Harry Potter was recommended to me by Reading Rainbow. So I went to the school library, and at that time, if you wanted to go to the library as a class, you had to watch Reading Rainbow beforehand. So here I am in the Spanish class watching Reading Rainbow, and I had been dodging Harry Potter for the longest time. And anyway, started reading it in the 7th grade. And then, of course, at that time, she hadn't finished the series. So I didn't stop the series until it ended, and I was like 22. So that by far is the best-selling kids series of all time. So there's that. But before Harry Potter and before the Babysitters Club, there was one thing everybody was talking about in elementary school, and it was Goosebumps. If you weren't reading anything by R.L. Stine, who were you? Seriously. And, that started in 1992, and it was the big deal at the Scholastic Book Fair. You either had a Babysitter's Club book or a Goosebump book or both, if you really could stretch it. And he was the reigning champ of kids' book series until J.K. Rowling comes along in 1997, 98. So from 92 to 97, he wrote 62 books that were in the original series, starting with Welcome to Dead House. And I remember being a kid in the cafeteria, and everybody is trying to chug along and read as many of these books as possible. It was very hard to get your hand on a copy if you were checking them out from the school library, because they were always reserved. You always had to put your name on the wait list. And so I used to try to shake my parents down for a book every now and then. And sometimes you can get them at the local library. But you ended up with the same problem there. So you might have to wait on a wait list for somebody to bring it back or whatever. But sometimes you could get them on sale at the local bookstore, and I had a couple. And then I would lend them out. We would just trade them and just read as much as possible. So R.L. Stine had elementary school kids from ages 7 to 12 in a chokehold. Right now, he's doing a book tour where you can come and meet him and get your books autographed. Right now, in my 30s, I want to meet that man and tell him he shaped a profound time in my life where I was all about horror. And he's part of the reason why I don't like ventriloquist dummies now. So, there's that. So, R.L. Stine had 62 of his original Goosebumps written and eventually made into a TV series and a movie. But he also had Goosebumps Series 2000, Give Yourself Goosebumps, Goosebumps Horrorland, Goosebumps Most Wanted, and Goosebumps Slappy's World. And I think that he just came out with Goosebumps House of Shivers or something of that nature right around the end of last year. So, in all of his collection, he's still number 2 after Harry Potter. And I think he holds strong at selling 400 million. And my friends and I were discussing how sometimes you'll see the books and they look slightly different than the covers that we had. And they've been kind of, looked over and updated for, better references and things like that. But they're still out there in their entirety. So if I had to think back on some of the books that I read that left a profound impact on me in this series, I think we all know that the first one that I'm going to say is The Haunted Mask. It's also the first one that they made a TV movie, but it was really like the first episode in the series. And to this day, I can see the horrid mask on Carly Beth's face, but I also remember reading it and being like, she's going to have to stay like this forever. Strange. So it still gives me the creeps to this day. So poor Carly Beth, she is bullied at school, always picked on, and easily scared. And Halloween is not her favorite holiday. But she plans on taking control of the holiday this year and scaring those who always scare her. And she's trying to get the most creepy mask. Well, her first red flag should have been that she wandered into this back room in this joke shop where only like 5 or 6 masks were. And her second red flag should have been that the proprietor didn't want to sell her this mask. But it tried to adhere to her skin, tried to take over her, and, she had to get out of there. And in the way that R.L. Stine usually does things, it was kind of a not really happy ending. He kind of leaves things open. And it was kind of unsettling for me. And it still is. I remember reading, I was probably about 8 or 9. And it's funny because my mom was very strict about what I read, what I could read, what I could watch, and what I could listen to. All of those things. But she seemed to be okay with allowing me to read certain Goosebumps books. I haven't read all 62, and I probably should do just a short blog post on reading all of them. But there were a couple I was able to get my hands on, and that was courtesy of the school library. Number 2 has to be Stay Out of the Basement. That was probably the first book in the series that I read, if not the second. It was probably a toss-up between those two, The Haunted Mask and Stay Out of the Basement, but I read them right around the same time. And I also remember that being one of the episodes in the series, which also solidified freaking me out. And it was one that I watched with my mom. So that was fun because she almost never watched what I was watching in its entirety and gave into the whole thing. But anybody who watched it, I know you guys remember when, you have a father who is doing weird experiments in basements and the kids think he's acting weird. They know something is wrong, but they're not sure what. And, when you're a kid, especially in the Goosebumps realm, when you're a kid, you tend to say things to people and nobody really believes you, which will bring me to my next choice. But nobody really believes you. So you have to have sufficient evidence and, they're constantly told to stay out of the basement. The doors are heavily locked. They don't want to mess with their dad's experiments. And I often wondered, what exactly did their father do? It was like he was a scientist, but what was he working on actually? And also, why is he not doing it in a lab of any kind? He's doing it in the basement of their own house. That's strange. But anyway, they, of course, go downstairs and figure out that there is another father who looks just like him. And he's being kept hostage, and who's really the father, who's the fake. And I believe there's a point where they knock the hat off his head and he's growing leaves out of his head. It really played with my sense of reality, who's real and who's not. And at the end, it's even more unsettling because when they make a decision and they think they've made the right one, that they finally gotten their father back, they realize that there are a lot more plant daddies than they thought. And the person that they may be sharing their life with still might not be their real father. So that was hella creepy. Of course, Night of the Living Dummy would be my next guess. And again, I still don't like ventriloquist dummies. Slappy, it was just odd to read a story where you're being terrorized by a ventriloquist dummy. Although, it's not any different than Chucky, right? But of course, I wasn't allowed to watch that until I was much older. So this was my first foray into being terrorized by a doll. And I gotta say, I came from it with some battle scars, okay? So the girl, she's trying out new hobbies, new talents. I can't imagine, even in the 90s, somebody wanting to be a ventriloquist dummy. But who knows? Everybody's got to start somewhere. So they buy her, I think her parents buy her a ventriloquist dummy from this old shop. And vintage things, after watching so many of these kind of shows and reading so many of these kind of books, you tend to wonder, where exactly did you get this from? And of course, it comes with a card that's in his pocket, and she reads it and he comes to life. So he starts doing things and she keeps getting blamed for them, attacking her sister and all of these things. And so it's just a bunch of crap. Really weird. But then she keeps trying to tell people man, this is really the dummy. This is Slappy doing this, And of course, nobody believes her. He's trying to take people out, hit people with guitars and all kind of stuff. It's ridiculous. And her family finally figures it out and they try to do him in. And you think that that's the end. But not really, because he wrote 2 or 3 more Night of the Living Dummies, and they progressively get worse and worse. So Slappy was not my favorite, but of course I could not look away. And the doll that they had in the original episode was like this really weird, like redhead doll with these very big eyes, and the eyes just kept moving back and forth. And whoever was controlling the doll, they were doing a good job because it really creeped me out. And again, I'm not a fan of dolls to this day. That, and then like Toy Story came out shortly after that, so it didn't do anything for me. So next would be Say Cheese and Die. And this was very hard to get a hold of at my school. And it was like, you knew people that read it, but like, where could you get a copy? I was always like last on the list. And then finally, I was able to get one. So I was able to get that book from a friend of mine, Sherman, who ended up being my best friend at the time. And he had finished Say Cheese and Die, and everybody at the lunch table was talking about it, and you were nobody if you didn't know what they were talking about. So, and it was a big deal because you had to read it before the episode came out. So here I am reading a book with a bunch of dead people on the cover, skeletons on the cover. So I was having to like sneak that in and out of the house because my mother would have wanted to know where I got this from and why I had it. Contraband, if you will. So I read it. It was about a kid who ended up at this really weird, I don't know that they called it a haunted house, right? But they knew that there was like weird things that happened inside this house. So they were in there, and I'm not sure exactly what it was they were looking for. But they stumbled upon this camera, and the camera, which they thought was great. Like, you know, this is an expensive camera. Obviously we can't wait to take pictures or whatever. And I knew from the very beginning that this was a bad idea, you know? So of course they start taking pictures. The pictures come out really weird, right? Like he takes a picture of his brother in front of the new car, and the new car is all crashed up. Well, the next day his brother gets into a horrible car accident, which he survives, but still really strange. Then he takes a picture of his friend that's standing by a tree, and the picture comes out without the friend in it, but then the friend goes missing. And so it's not long before our main character figures out that the camera is predicting the future or forcing the future to be as bad as it shows in these pictures. So he's trying to get rid of these pictures, this camera, as much as possible. Like at one point he tries to like abandon it, and it like shows back up. It's very weird. And they end up, you know, getting rid of the camera, and, you know, taking the pictures to a Photoshop and having the pictures made into negatives and things like that to get things back on track. But I just remember being like, why would you have left this crazy house with anything from inside the house? Like, there are certain red flags there. If the house is condemned or nobody's lived there in years, you probably shouldn't be taking anything out of there. And now you then inflict this camera on the world at large. And so, of course, there is a sequel, Say Cheese and Die Again. And I mean, it's it stays in my mind because it's one of those things that you think is innocuous, and now it's ruined your life. You know what I mean? So there's that. The next one that I believe I read was the girl who cried monster. And just like in any stories you heard, the girl who cried wolf or whatever, she's constantly making up stories about seeing monsters and different things to scare her brother. Her younger brother, who, you know, is easy to scare. She needs something to do during the summertime. And I get it. Well, the problem is her parents enrolled her into this library program and she has to go there for the summer. And for some reason, she gets to the library during the summer. There's nobody there. Just her and the weird librarian, Mr. Morton. So she's there. She's picking out books or whatever. She leaves. She's on her way home. She's forgotten something because that's what kids do. And she doubles back to get it. Well, there she sees Mr. Morton with his jar of flies, and his eyes bug out, and he's revealed to be this really weird alien monster who, you know, eats bugs and perhaps people, who knows. And of course, she goes home. She's raving about it to her parents and anybody who will listen. And nobody believes her. Shocker. So she's forced to endure constantly going to the library because her parents want her to be enrolled in the summer program. They don't believe a word she's saying. And the librarian figures out that she knows his secret. And so he keeps trying to get her alone, possibly to eat her. Who knows? Well, the kicker is at the end, there's always a plot twist, right? Or maybe sometimes a letdown or even a cliffhanger, depending on which book you're reading. The plot twist in this book is that she tells her parents, they invite him over for dinner to try to make amends because she's constantly spreading all of these lies and she has a wild imagination, right? Well, when they get him over, they basically tell him, you know, we're going to eat you for dinner. And he's like, excuse me? What? And before he can say anything, it is revealed that her parents are also monsters and they eat him down in front of the kids and reveal to her that, yeah, you know, we've been living here for years and we're the only people that are allowed to be monsters around these parts. So we had to eat him. You guys will get your fangs shortly and we'll show you how to use them. And that's how the story ended. I was like, wait, what? What does that mean for other people in the community? You know what I mean? But you know, with R.L. Stine, you don't really get closure. So there you have it. And then finally, The Ghost Next Door. This is another one that really played with my sense of reality because whatever you think you know going into it in the beginning, you really don't know. And it's up there with The Werewolf of Fever Swamp, where they know that there's a werewolf out there and whoever you think is the werewolf is not. And then our main character becomes the werewolf and then he starts leaning into it. That's another good one. But The Ghost Next Door is all about this girl who befriends this little boy and they're hanging out, and all things point to the fact that this boy that she's hanging out with is a ghost. And she's trying to really like piece it all together because she wants to be able to prove, like, you know, you're dead, you're hanging out with me, you have unfinished business, or whatever. So it was funny because at the end, it's revealed that she's actually the dead one. And so the unfinished business is that her family died in a fire. And I can't remember if the fire was accidentally set or was set on purpose, but her house, burns down and she's dead and doesn't know it. So take that, M. Night Shyamalan. But she's dead and she doesn't know it. And she keeps interacting with the boy next door who realizes that she is in fact the ghost. And they're trying to uncover who set this fire because she's being followed by this man in black and she can't figure out why. Well, of course, the man in black is Death and he's trying to take her over to the other side because that's where her family is. And they end up recreating this fire. The little boy almost dies, but she's able to save him even though she can't touch him. And in the end, once she realizes that she was in fact the ghost, she goes with the man in black to the other side to hang out with her family. But that, I remember being a wild ride. And that was all for the longest time. That was all we talked about. I actually had to be told by my 4th and 5th grade teachers that my book reports couldn't be on Goosebumps. I had to read something else. Sad, But I mean, there were trading cards and, you got to watch the show. And it was interesting to see how they crammed everything into a 30-minute show from a book that you read that had like 3,000 chapters. I'm kidding. It was a lot of chapters for a young person, but not really. And, that was our first foray into watching something on TV that had been adapted from a book that was popular that you read. So we enjoyed everything about that. We had trading cards. We were almost never focused in middle school, more than usual, so it is what it is. But shout out to R.L. Stine for Goosebumps. Luckily for me, moving on to middle school didn't mean I had to leave behind R.L. Stine because he continued writing Ghost of Fear Street and Fear Street books for everybody who was older than the target audience for Goosebumps. So that's where things got really hairy because, as you know, if you've ever read Goosebumps, nobody ever dies. This person is either already dead for something that happened or, weird stuff happens, kind of paranormal activities, but nobody dies. And it kind of plays with your sense of reality or whatever. But there's never a murder or anything like that. On the flip side, Fear Street is where he started killing people left and right. And I don't think I was ready for that. I think that knowing that his name was on the title or the cover of the book, I think I knew what I was getting into, but no. So I had read a couple like The Stepsister or The Boy Next Door or The Cheater and realized where I realized that this character is in a situation where they might be murdered or several people are going to be murdered. So, but yeah, I remember off the top of my head, like Truth or Dare was, and he has another book in this series called The Ski Weekend, which is actually about a weekend trip. But the Truth or Dare was about a group of friends that went to a ski lodge, and just like Agatha Christie, they get to the ski lodge and then people start dropping like flies. Like people are dying left and right. So you had to find the killer. Switched was about this girl and she had this best friend, and the best friend seemed like she had the life. She had great parents. She had, great siblings. She had everything going for her. She was going to college, all of these things, right? Well, they wander off into the woods and they find like this wall, this magical wall. And they figured out that if you jump off this kind of wall cliff structure together, that you can switch bodies. But each time you do it, you switch for longer and longer. So they kind of enjoyed living each other's lives. And then I think they agreed that they're going to do this switch permanently. And of course, like, I'm in middle school, so these people that I was reading about was probably in high school. So as an adult now, I realize that, you know, they're really still kids. But as a kid in middle school, I was like, why in the world would you do this? This sounds like a bad idea. But anyway, they decide to make the switch permanent. And our main character goes to her friend's house as her friend and is going to live her life. Except the friend has like murdered everybody in the house. Parents, siblings, left a note telling her that's what she did. And then, you know, there are two things going on. Like, now, I don't know if I can get my body back and I'm going to be blamed for these murders. And then the second thing was, I've now sent this murderer to my house with my family, you know. It was very stressful for me during the reading breaks in middle school that we had to do. And my mother said to me the other day, you did not tell me that you were reading about this kind of horror. Of course not, because then you wouldn't let me do it. So there's that. But R.L. Stine did not come to play. So, and I remember like trying to get to the end of that book. I can't even remember how the book ends. I think you never can tell with R.L. Stine because you think it's like happily ever after, but is it really ever? I'm going to have to look that up again, possibly read that again. But I remember that being the premise of the book. And then they did one about like the stepsister who was, what I realize now was like mentally ill, but she was like trying to kill off her sister. It's ridiculous. She tried to like put peroxide in her shampoo and like tried to poison her. And like, this woman is out to get you. Okay. She's got a vendetta against you, as if you're the reason that the parents got married, you know. Tried to push her down the stairs. And then they finally figure out like this woman is trying to murder her sister, our main character. And they finally lock her away. But of course, you know, he brings her back in a different book where she's been declared sane. So she's moving back in. Or is she? You know. And so there's that unsettling feeling again. But yeah, you know, another person that was with me reading wise throughout my life was definitely R.L. Stine. So, I'll probably graduate to that at some point, giving that to my niece, but she's in her Babysitters Club era right now. So, you know, and I can see that there's some Goosebump books that they say they're going to be made into like comics or graphic novels or something like that. So maybe that'll help. We'll see. Maybe it'll make it worse. Who knows? I might get a couple copies of those. So that'll be fun. And I think the last series that kind of stuck with me when I was a kid is the Janie Johnson series. The Face on the Milk Carton, The Voice on the Radio. All things about Janie Johnson, who, if you read the first book, The Face on the Milk Carton, she is a girl who's at school. I think she's like in middle school, if I remember correctly. And this was another one that was made into like TV movies or something like that. Because I remember watching it on TV as well. But The Face on the Milk Carton was basically about this girl who I believe, I think she was it doesn't matter. She was in school and she's having lunch in the cafeteria. And I think somebody points out to her that you know, this missing child on the milk carton looks a lot like you. And she glances down at it and she's like, okay. I mean, this kid does kind of look like me, but this child's name is Jenny Spring. And, that's not my name, so it can't be me. But anyway, she kind of puts it out of her mind and she goes home. And she starts, asking her parents about, her young life. Well, it is revealed that Janie Johnson, aka Jenny Spring, was a girl who was kidnapped from a shopping mall when she was 3 years old. So that would be why her face is on the milk carton. And she's like, there's no way that you guys, my parents who I've known all this time, are kidnappers. And she's like, now I have to figure out who I am, And I remember, reading this and being like, man, I have no clue what my life would be like if everything I thought I knew is not actually the case, So after having the conversation with her parents, they're not really all that forthcoming, right? They don't, in that initial conversation, they don't really want to answer questions. So she starts having flashbacks about a life that she doesn't remember living, but it's definitely her. So she starts digging through the attic and she starts finding paperwork about this girl named Hannah and the dress that she's wearing in the picture on the milk carton. And she goes back and confronts her parents. This is where they finally admit that they did not kidnap her, but that their daughter, Hannah, did. So she grew up with these people who she thought were her parents. They're not. They're actually old enough to be like grandparents if she wasn't kidnapped by this woman who is their daughter. They talk about how their daughter Hannah, is kind of mentally ill and, all of these things. But I often wondered, like, if you knew your daughter was mentally ill and she came back with this child, why didn't you say anything about it? But they said that she ran off and married some man in a cult, and that she showed up to their house with Janie years ago. So they never asked her where this child came from. They just kept her. So while their story seems to check out, she is, torn to have to like say, like, I've been kidnapped and, she is trying to figure out where her family is. She enlists her boyfriend, Reeve, who, helps her locate the family. She goes to be with them. And then, these stories are never what you think they are. It's never like, oh, everybody's a big happy family now, because there's a lot going on, And then that was a whole thing. And then, of course, like the voice on the radio, Reeve goes to college, and with lack of anything that he can talk about on the radio, he starts telling a story. Once upon a time. The problem is he starts telling the story about Janie and her experiences with finding her family and having to do visitation with them and having to fit in, and them still looking at her as a kid and all of these things. And it's gotten him all this popularity. But then he has to admit to Janie that he's like become the big man on campus because he's telling her story. So that kind of sucked, Reeve. What was that, But that was a really good series that I remember standing out of my mind, and even more so watching as much true crime as I do, realizing that a lot of the missing kids were put on milk cartons. A lot of kids were found, a lot of kids weren't, so that was a big deal. All right, so let's end it out with a couple of honorable mentions. Everybody in my middle school was reading Animorphs. By that time, I had decided I was going to do like some other things. I was probably still reading Fear Street, but some other things. And I just knew I wasn't going to take on another book series. But Animorphs was a big deal. A series about a group of kids who can change into different animals for maybe like an hour or two, as long as they touch them. And those were flying off the shelves. So I never saw what the big deal was, but people loved it. And, that's one of the things that stands out in my mind, because when I go to the bookstore, a lot of books from my childhood are being resold, repackaged, revisited. I have not seen Animorphs, and I think Scholastic is missing out on that. I used to read a lot of Amelia Bedelia. Boy, that woman couldn't do a job to save her life. And how she kept being employed was beyond me. But I used to love those. I also read a lot of the American Girl books. Because, I couldn't afford the dolls. Still can't. But I read the books, mostly about Addie. Because she was the Black American girl. And so at some point that was your rite of passage to read about her. And I think my mother used that as kind of a reading comprehension tool, because she used to make me do book reports at home, and it used to be on American Girl. And you would have to tell her what happened in the book. What does that mean? How did these things come together? How did the book end? So I had a few of those. And then the Miss Nelson collection, she's missing, she's back. Miss Nelson was a mean teacher. Why they wanted her back was beyond me. But I love those. And then, of course, Nancy Drew, The Hardy Boys, which I found out as an adult. These were all written under a pen name by a group of different writers, ghost writers. So that kind of hurt, but I realized that that's not uncommon in the publishing world. And then Encyclopedia Brown. I think that was something along the lines of where I was going to transition from everything horror to everything mystery. So eventually I would get into Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes and all of these things. But I think it started with Encyclopedia Brown. All right, so that's it for me. But in the end, peeps, the Scholastic Book Fair stays out in my mind. I read a meme one day that says I'm still trying to catch the high that I had with money in my pocket, not a bill to my name, and the Scholastic Book Fair to look forward to. And I always did, because it usually happened the week of my birthday or just before my birthday. So people would be sending me money. You know, your extended family would always send you cards with money in it, and then the money would fall out and you have to pretend like you're reading the card. But now you knew you had like $40 or $50 to work with. You can get a poster, you get a couple of posters, you can get a couple of Goosebump book. Man, it was a good time. So I say that to say Scholastic Books, they knew what they were doing with this book fair. And I think that we need to have more book fairs for adults. So let's just throw that out there. But that's all I got for now, peeps. I'll see you next time.